Welcome to Guerrilla Discipleship. I'm Kevin Baker.
I'm Tim Parker.
Tim Parker and I are continuing to talk about relational evangelism, trying to, as much as we can, get you to think outside of the stereotypes of negative things about evangelism, and to just realize that talking to people about Jesus is the same as talking to people about our spouse, about our family, about what we do for a living. Whatever it is, that we want to make our conversations about Jesus so natural, our conversations, about spiritual things so natural that it would be hard not to talk about them. I think we've almost trained ourselves not to have spiritual conversations because we've been told those things are offensive or people will be upset or whatever. But done in the right way, that's not the case. So we want to talk about some strategies today. We were talking a little bit about just the idea of seeing this as relational, starting relationships, opportunities to serve last time. Today what I want to talk about is the power of stories, especially biblical stories. One of the things that people are in our culture is a culture of story. We love stories. We love movies. We love books. We love stories, and people love stories, and so they can relate to stories because they see themselves in it, or that story reminds them of something. So how do you use stories in your own evangelism, Tim, or is there another way that you think about stories that would be helpful for us today?
I was just been thinking since we started, and then we're talking about stories, just the power that they have to really draw people in.
Yeah.
Everyone, even I was just thinking, even when you watch like NBA championships or NHL as championships, there's always people root for the team that has the better story.
Yeah.
People, even if it's a game, there's always like a story and there's meaning behind it. And people said, well, this will make a better story. And I think we just have this longing to be put in shoes, or we have this natural empathy that we want to associate. And so I think we're going to get into this, but I think it's good to memorize or have different Bible stories at your resources, simply so that you can encourage and talk to someone. So I was thinking of the story of Jonah, and I've had a couple people come up to me before, or in a conversation where they're just like, I just feel like I'm running from God, or God and I are on really good terms right now, or I'm not sure I really believe if there's something going, but everywhere I turn, it seems like something's going wrong.
That's good.
And you're like, you're not the first person to feel that. And like, what do you mean? Like, well, not only have I felt that, but there's a guy, in the Bible called Jonah who felt like God was telling him to do one thing and he ran the other direction. Yeah. You go, oh, what happened to him? Well, it ended up pretty rough. I mean, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but you can kind of draw those connections. And sometimes it's really powerful because a lot of times the story that pops into my head when I'm sharing something with someone about what God's doing or something that's tough going on, it's usually not the story that I would make the connection for them, but God kind of gives me one. I'm like, oh, I never saw that story from that connection, and it kind of just comes out that way. So
Tim's point there is so good, and that is that a lot of times people are already experiencing something, but they don't have a story to fit it into or to relate it to. If we can memorize, and I really think 5 to 10 stories, it's not too much, that you have so clearly in your head that you can then, if you're talking to someone and they say, I feel like I'm running from God, and you can relate it back to the story. But let's just think of some stories for a second. Let's think of some circumstances and then some stories that relate to it.
That's fun.
So here's the circumstance. The circumstance is that someone has been living apart from God, and they basically are at the end of their rope, feeling like all the decisions I've made are they're not good, and my life is turning out way differently than I wanted it to turn out. I'm not happy. I don't know what to do at this point. I'm feeling desperate. Is there a story in the Bible that brings to mind?
Oh man, I can think of a couple.
Okay.
The first one, when you first started talking, I had one story, and the second part I had a different story.
All right, well, bring it.
The first one was the thief on the cross. No matter how bad you've been, no matter how far you've gotten, no matter if you feel like you're just inches away from death, Jesus still wants to be with you. Yeah. He still wants to dwell with you in for eternity. Awesome. The other one, though, when you said kind of going down a wrong path and made some bad choices and they ended up in a bad circumstance, I thought of Paul on the road to Damascus.
Wow.
And probably two different stories than you had. Paul, how he went from killing Christians and then had to come to Jesus moment and completely changed his life. But it took him being blinded
Yeah.
in order for him to kind of see that. And so you would maybe encourage him, like, hey, maybe you're feeling like you're blinded, maybe you feel like you're handicapped, not in a bad way, but that you're just not functioning on all cylinders, but maybe
Yeah.
God's calling you to use your gifts and talents in a new way and redeem you just like he redeemed this guy.
Now, the story that I had in my mind, and I really didn't know where I was going to go when I was telling the story, but I was the prodigal son.
Ah, okay.
That, it's an experience of kind of doing life on his own, and getting to the place where all of the things that he thought he was in control of or that he was doing well just led him to a pit of despair, and wondering, can I go home again? And I think that's what I encounter with people sometimes is, how could God forgive me now that I've done all of these things? So again, just having the prodigal son story allows us to say, well, there was a story of someone who felt similar to you, but any of the stories that Tim's talking about are good too.
Here's one I just recently used.
Okay.
Talking to a young man who was working 5 days a week and then all weekend long, and he's been coming to a Discovery Bible study, and he was really struggling because he kind of got fired from his job, kind of quit at the same time. It's a weird circumstance. I won't go into detail. And he was just like, man, I really need to be working. I need to be moving. I need to be doing something all the time. And I told him his name. I was like, well, do you remember the story of how in Genesis, how God created everything? He's like, kind of. And so he went through it. I said, do you know what he did on the seventh day? What? He rested. And I said, so if God rests, do you think you need it? He's like, yeah, but I don't like it. I'm like, but if God rests, and he didn't need it, why do you think he did that? He's like, maybe it was for an example. I was like, okay, well then maybe you should enjoy being off and rest, and maybe your other job, you won't hate your life so much because you won't be working 80 hours a week.
Now, the thing that came to my mind when you were talking about that was the story of Mary and Martha. And Martha being so hurried and always feeling like she had to get everything done and that she had to serve people and not having any time to really just draw and be sitting with God. And she even complains to Jesus, tell my sister she has to help me. And Jesus says, I'm not going to get Mary away from the place that she's at. So I do think, but that's a good story, right? Those are good stories that God rested. We must need rest. And because we live in a culture that is always hurried. Mary and Martha is that story of feeling like we're constantly having too much burden and getting angry even with God, because she was kind of angry at Jesus that he was not condemning Mary for not helping her more. And then Jesus coming back and saying, hey, there's going to be plenty of time to do all that you want. How about this? A person who is feeling basically like they're facing just an unmanageable circumstance, that they're feeling like they're drowning in some way. They feel like they're maybe drowning in debt, drowning in pain, maybe, but here's my cue for you. There's a storm in their life that they can't handle. Any story come to mind there?
I actually had a different one.
Okay, well, give us the other one. You and I think of totally different stories, that's for sure.
I mean, I'll let you take that one. I was thinking about the lady who bled for so many years.
Yeah.
And she was just in utter pain, and not just the physical pain, but the societal pain, because she wasn't allowed to be in public because of the purity laws, and she wasn't even allowed to go to synagogue because she wasn't clean, and just all that, and how she literally just reached out.
That's
and
good.
I think I was reading that passage the other day. That's what's on my mind, and it's actually more grabs Jesus than just touches. People think it's just like a gentle, but she I wanted his attention. She grabs a hold of it firmly, and Jesus heals her, and talking about you maybe have gone through pain for forever. It may have destroyed your life, or destroyed your plans, or destroyed your relationships, or just been inconvenienced or uncomfortable. But reaching out in Jesus and having that powerful experience can heal you.
That story always reminds me of people who feel completely hopeless. Mm-hmm. Because how could you, after 12 years, you've seen all the doctors, all the preachers, you've been prayed over, nothing has healed you, and you're just going to feel hopeless. So that's what that story reminds me of. The one I was thinking about is the disciples on the boat going across the Sea of Galilee. These are experienced fishermen. Jesus is down sleeping. They wake him up. Don't you care about us? And Jesus comes up and calms the wind and the waves. And so that idea of helping people who are feeling like, man, the storms of life are overwhelming me, to remind them that there is a God who basically, there's no storm he can't calm. And helping them to see in that story, helping them to see themselves in that story. Again, that's what these stories are for. But you've got to know the story. You've got to feel like you've got 5 to 10 stories in your head, in your heart, that because you're not saying, let me go, this is what you don't want to do. somewhere in the Bible it says, let me find it real quick. They need to be something you could repeat in your own words, just very quickly, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 2-minute story. That's it.
And I realize that we probably make it look a little easy because we went to seminary and we were trained to look at things
Maybe.
theologically. But if I can offer some words of encouragement, you don't have to have a seminary degree to be able to do this.
No.
I would encourage you that when you do read a passage in the Bible to say, well, who might this apply to when you are going through it? Or looking at it from different angles, or ask the same questions to yourself or someone else that Jesus is asking in the passage.
Yeah.
And that some of the easier passages or stories to memorize, not word for word, is the parables.
Yeah.
Those are always, or the miracles of Jesus are really easy to kind of dig your teeth into, unlike maybe some stories of prophets in the Old Testament.
Yeah, I mean, what's another circumstance in life that people are facing today that we might come up and they might be in distress about? Anything come to your mind?
I would say life just feels out of control. I could say someone could feel like, I just feel like I have no control over a thing, that life's happening to me.
Yeah.
I'm just barely able to react to what's happening.
Sure.
I think that could be.
And what would be a story? Do you have a story? I mean,
I wasn't thinking while I was talking, so I was going to let you do this one.
Well, the boat is another story, I think, where, again, there's no circumstance too big for God to help or to overcome. He can calm the wind and the waves. He can calm whatever storm you're going through. There may be some others. I'm not. They're not coming to my mind right now.
Neither am I.
There's a story about 10 lepers that meet Jesus, and they want to be healed. They call out to him. You may remember this story. And Jesus says, "Go on and present yourselves to the priest." On the way to them, they are obedient to God, to what Jesus says. On the way, they realize they've been healed. And out of the 10, only one comes back and says, "Thank you." And Jesus says, "Where are the other 9? We're not all 10 healed." What's that a story that we could use? What's a circumstance in life that story could help us with or teach us about?
I think that's about gratitude.
Yeah.
Definitely. That a lot of times God has done things for us and we aren't grateful for it. And so you might be mean or talking to someone and they can mean, I had a really good upbringing, or I went to a college, or I got a scholarship, and I felt like I've had all these things, but I just don't know, I don't think I've really seen God in my life.
Yeah.
What do you mean you haven't seen God in your life? Don't you have a family and kids? Don't you have what you wanted? Didn't you have this dream? Didn't you have this? Well, yeah, and I own my own business, but I'm not sure if God's ever shown himself to me. And you're like, maybe what you've already been through is him showing himself to you already.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I think, the question could be, which one of those, who do you want to be? More like the 9 who just got healed and went on? Or do you want to be like the 1 who came back? And so that could be an encouragement, as you said, Tim, to encourage gratitude. Maybe there are small things that God's doing in our lives every day, and we're failing to give him thanks for that. Maybe that's a teaching moment for a parent that, hey, how often are you thankful to God for the things that you have? So the point of all of this really is to say that if we can get some stories, and they don't have to just be New Testament.
Right.
Tim's used some Old Testament. David and Goliath, great story. He talked about Job. There are times when our kids are going to feel like they're facing giants, maybe a bully or something. And there's stories that we can use from both the Old and New Testament, or the Hebrew scriptures and the scriptures about Jesus and the church, to help understand what God is like, and to hold on to those stories so that I can see how, if God did that in that story, God can maybe do that in my story as well. So 5 to 10 doesn't have to be, you don't have to know them word for word, but 5 to 10 stories. I love the prodigal son story. The woman who had the 12 years of hemorrhage is another great story. Jesus feeding the 5,000 is a great story about his ability to bring kingdom provision into the daily needs of our lives. What are some other biblical stories that stand out to you?
I think
Tim?
the walls of Jericho is a big one.
Ooh,
not just
walls
the
of
giants,
Jericho.
but the God's going to knock down the walls, and it might not happen in the way or time or what you expect.
Yeah.
But God's going to knock those walls down.
And I think the story of the woman at the well, here's a story of a woman who is sort of shunned from culture because of her actions. She's known, her life is known, and she most of us have told the story that she goes to the well in the middle of the day, which is not normal because you don't do that in the hot part of the day, but that Jesus doesn't shun her. Story of the woman caught in adultery, where he shows her compassion. And so sometimes people come to us with circumstances, not just us, but you feeling like they've committed the unforgivable sin. And in that story with the woman caught in adultery, I mean, she was clearly guilty. And Jesus said, I'm not here to condemn you. That story's got all of these stories have so many twists to it, because he says, I'm not here to condemn you, but he tells her to go and sin no more. So he doesn't shy away from owning the fact that you were caught in sin. He just says, I'm not here to condemn you. I'm actually here to rescue you and show you compassion. So there's a lot to each one of these stories, but they don't take more than 4 or 5 minutes to memorize, to just sort of, because stories are easy to memorize. It's harder to memorize narratives in the scripture, but to just remember a story, to get the story underneath you, to give yourself chance to say, what's the point of this story, God? And some stories like the prodigal son have so many different aspects to them. Because one of the things about the prodigal son story, for instance, that people sometimes neglect is that we talk about the prodigal son, the one that went away, did all the bad things, but there's the elder brother. And here's the thing about the elder brother. He never leaves home, but he never has the intimacy with the father that the prodigal does when he returns. The elder brother won't go in to the celebration. He stays outside. Yeah. And so sometimes there are those who would say to us things like, I've never done anything wrong. I've lived a good life. I've lived a good life. Yeah. I've always gone to church, but I don't feel close to God. Maybe you're like the elder brother because in order to be close to God, we have to know God's heart, and God's heart it's for prodigals, not just for prodigals. He loves elder brothers as well. But if we don't have our Father's heart, it's going to be hard and don't know our Father's heart, it's going to be hard to have a close relationship with him. So here's your task for this week. We're going to make this short today. Your task is to read through the New Testament, especially the Gospels, and get 5 stories. We're going to start with 5 rock-solid stories that you could repeat and that you can begin to just allow them to be a part of what you do as you're interacting with people, your family, your kids, that you're going to bring up and say, there's a story. And you don't even have to say it's a story from the Bible. No. You can just say, I once heard a story about this, and let Jesus be the hero in their life and show them how that can happen. Anything else on that, Tim, that you want to share? I think that's great. I was going to add that if you already know 5, then make it 5 more. There you go. I love that. So if you're already 5 stories deep, go into 10. All right. Thank you so much for being a part of Guerrilla Discipleship. Tim, thank you for doing this with me. No problem. I love it. I just love these conversations. If they're helpful to you, let us know. T. Parker at Oakdale.church, K. Baker at Oakdale.church, and let us know how we can empower you and equip you to be the disciple maker that God's called you to be. By the way, that's what God has done, right? He's asked us to make disciples. If you know Jesus, that's the command that should be governing a lot of your life, is go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you. And he's never going to leave us. Baptizing them when we get the opportunity to see them come to faith. But disciple making starts with simply teaching people how to obey Christ. All right, that's our job, that's our task, and we here at Guerrilla Discipleship love partnering with you. Hey, we'll see you next week. God bless you.